Not going.
We're recording. Okay.
Everything's prepared and professional and ready to roll.
My allergies have hit hard, so I'm like just chugging tea. Hopefully it doesn't like clog up a bit.
That really says. Morning, Matthew.
Says we're recording.
Yep. There's a way to.
Okay. It says my speaker's not working properly. Can you guys hear me okay, or?
Yeah, like totally perfect on my end.
Yay. Okay, great. How you all doing?
Good.
Great.
Yeah, pretty good.
Okay, let me.
How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing good. Yeah. Looking forward to Mel and I are gonna start clearing out some junk this afternoon from our house. So looking forward to that.
Nice.
Oh, yeah. Bath Township has a nice like junk day where you can take a trailer to of junk and just get rid of it for free. So, but that's like several weeks from now. So we have like several Saturdays to build up to the point. So,
Man.
um, let me just maybe you guys can help me figure out this recording stuff, and then I will get to sharing my screen. So, just one moment. Okay. Okay. Well, welcome again, everybody. It's great to have you this morning. Looking forward to diving into our third session here on community garden committee seminar stuff. So thanks so much for coming. Let's see. All right. First, I've just got a couple introductory slides that I wanted to go over to orient us to our time. Some session norms. You can introduce yourself if you haven't already, and we also wanted to introduce ourselves. So first, just wanted to make you all aware, remember your mute buttons. It looks like everybody, or most everybody's muted right now. That's usually helpful. And remember to unmute yourself if you'd like to speak. And if nobody's responding to you, then probably you're muted. So also feel free to turn on your camera if you feel comfortable doing so. We'd love to see you. If not, no worries. And also, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself into the chat, we'd love to just have your name listed there, where you're coming from, and if you want to make mention of anything you're hoping to learn more about today, we'd love to hear that too in the chat box. If anybody have any questions around where to find the chat, if you do, feel free to shout that out. Otherwise, hopefully you can locate that. Also just wanted to introduce ourselves here at Garden Project. My name is Matthew Romans. I'm the program and education specialist with Garden Project. So I head up a lot of the educational content that we try to get out into the community, like an introduction to gardening course that we're putting on across a lot of libraries throughout mid-Michigan. So if you know anybody who's looking for good gardening education, you could go to Garden Project's website and look at some of our events, and you'll be able to find more information about where we're presenting throughout this spring season over the next month. And then I'll let Stevie and Julie introduce themselves as well.
Hi, I'm Stevie Riley. I'm the New American Engagement Specialist. So I work with gardens that have high populations of immigrants, refugees, any new American, just to make sure that they have culturally familiar foods, information in their languages, anything they might need.
And I'm Julie Lehman. I'm Garden Project's program manager, and thrilled to be with you all this morning. I do some of our coordination of projects, but then also I'm hands-on at a handful of gardens as well. And I'm thrilled you guys were able to find a little time this morning. It'll be a good morning together.
And thanks everybody for starting to interact with the chat and introducing yourself there. It's good to see you. All right. So also just wanted to go over a little bit of our agenda and what the rest of the morning is going to look like together on our lovely webinar time. As I said, we've got about 90 minutes slated for this time. We could go a little bit shorter depending on how the time goes, but that's what we've got slated. So first, we're just doing the welcome and agenda. That is where we are right now. And then, and just right after that, I just wanted to go over a review of kind of the larger framework that we're operating out of this year, which is that we're presenting on our Garden Committee Toolkit. So I'll describe that in more detail in just a few moments. After that, I'm going to pass it over to Stevie again, and she's going to speak on our speaker topic, which is creating a multicultural space this morning, and outside of this morning too, more generally. Just talking this morning about it. And then the three of us are going to dive into some more specific tools that are a part of our larger toolkit. We're going to be talking about the things that are pertinent to this time of year: plot assignment, spring plotting, and welcome communication and orientation. And then we'll wrap up our time with some summary and questions. But do know that you are welcome to share comments and ask questions throughout the time. Feel free to just unmute yourself if you have a question that you want to shout out, or just pop it into the chat at any point, and we'll try to respond promptly. So, all right. First, just wanted to speak a little bit around the work that we do at Garden Project. We have a host of community gardens that we help support within our network throughout the mid-Michigan area that comprise a total of 30 acres of growing space and upwards of 88 community gardens. I wanted to highlight this morning some of the work that we do at our resource center, since the next opportunity, the big event that we have for garden leaders and committee members this season is going to be at the beginning of May, where we're doing a resource center orientation and introduction. So for those of you who aren't familiar with all that we have on offer there, we've got lots of free seeds and transplants. Our location is in the East Side neighborhood of Lansing, which is not far from the Frandor Shopping Center, if you're familiar with that, where we've got lots of free tools that you're welcome to borrow at any point that will be helpful for you to take for prepping things this spring. And then later in the season, we have other supplies for food preservation and more educational materials that might be helpful for gardeners within your spaces. And for those of you who want to look into more information, I wanted to make sure that our phone number and email was listed there too, so you can always jot those down quickly if you'd like. Okay, so as for the overall framework of what these seminars are about, this year we are going through the Garden Committee Toolkit, which is a set of 15 tools. They're shared tasks that will make your garden successful and sustainable. That's how we're framing things. So the way that we've done trainings before for garden leaders is that we have been more focused on how to start and set up a community garden, but we wanted to really pinpoint what are the key tasks that need to happen within any community garden to just keep it moving forward and keep it sustainable over time. So that's what these 15 tools are. You could also just think of the tools as the 15 tasks. What just needs to happen in order for a community garden to sustain from year to year to year, and not just sustain, but to thrive. So we've, on the next slide, I'm going to have a list of all 15 of those, but, and actually I'll just switch over to that right now, because right here we talk about how it's organized into 4 different categories. So you can see those 4 categories right here that are nicely colored. You've got the blue, the green, the reddish orange, and then the yellow at top. So we've got the tasks divided into these 4 categories. Because we thought it would be helpful to group the things that need to happen within a community garden, kind of based on some relation to one another. And the way that we're organizing these seminars this year is that we wanted to spread them out throughout the year so that we're going to be talking about those tasks kind of more in live and real time. So this morning we're covering the ones that are highlighted there. So we're going to be talking about how to assign plots well to gardeners who have applied and registered to your garden. And then the next step after that is how to plot out the space. And then lastly, Julie's going to cover how to host that spring garden orientation and welcome people into your space. So we'll begin getting into more detail in all three of those throughout the morning. Lastly, on this point, I just wanted to note that successful garden committees keep roles clear and straightforward, and they also understand that flexibility will be important. So there's, there's always a tension with everything in life, trying to set very clear roles and guidelines, but having some level of flexibility too. Things will change over time, but we're just trying to create a structure here for you that, these are guidelines. Everything that I just outlined in that last slide, these are guidelines of what we think will be helpful and important to do within a community garden, but there are different ways to frame this for people. So love your feedback on this whole framework too. And within this framework too, it's really important to note that this is all about garden committees. We've switched to this language because we're trying to encourage folks to think about leading gardens within teams. It's important for the sustainability of a garden that it's not just one person heading everything up, but that there's a group of people doing things together. And the last note here is just to learn and manage existing responsibilities before they take on more. So this is a progressive, incremental thing that we expect will be just a reality for community gardens over time. We're listing out 15 different tasks that need to happen, but we don't expect that a community garden just like takes all those on right at once. It's totally just the reality of life that it takes time for community gardens to build to all of those things. All right. Well, hopefully that overview is helpful in kind of, again, framing what we're doing here during these seminars and within this whole toolkit. We're going to be sharing some of these actual tangible tools and PDFs with you online. They're listed on our website, but we'll also be sharing some links throughout today's presentation. And you can find more information on our website too. So I'm going to pitch it over to Stevie, who's going to be speaking about our main topic, which is cultivating a multicultural space. Thanks, Stevie.
Yeah, I do apologize. My allergies have like really hit me like a freight train. So I have my tea here, and I'm gonna. I apologize if I start coughing. But today we're going to talk about, I changed it. I'm sorry. I changed it to cultivating a multicultural space, mostly because I like the garden pun, but also because it's a more active word for me. Because, it's like planting anything. We can put it in the ground and maybe it'll survive. Maybe it won't, maybe it will. But if we're really cultivating this and we're really putting in the effort, it'll thrive. And that's really how I feel about creating a multicultural space too, is we have to put in the effort. So the first thing I'd like to talk about, next slide please, is what is diversity? What are some different ways we can express diversity? You guys want to pop some diverse characteristics in chat? Or no, go ahead. Background and experience, yeah. Walks of life, everybody has a different experience. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways. Yeah, if we want to go to the next slide. Now, all these can make a very diverse community. These are just many different ways that we can be diverse: age and ability, religion, gender orientation, appearance, immigration status, your education level. I mean, even hairstyle can be, diversity. And I think sometimes it's really boiled down to race, but there's all these other different ways as well. So I really want everybody to start thinking about like all the different ways in which we are diverse. And so how do we cultivate this diversity in the garden, right? Especially if we don't have a connection to that community. Next slide, please. So part of it is defining what we're working towards, right? And realizing that, of course, this is a spectrum, and we may not be achieving our highest potential every time on every activity, but we just keep trying, right? So we can start with reality, recognizing that we don't all start from the same place. And then moving into equality, where everybody gets the same resource. And I like to use a person who uses a wheelchair as an example for this, right? The reality is that they're not starting from the same place as somebody who has no issues with mobility. And so, equality might be that, everybody gets a door. You can walk through the door, you can use the wheelchair through the door. You all have the same ability to go through the door. But then once we get into equity, it's now the door is actually maybe wide enough to get a wheelchair through comfortably. Or maybe you don't have to go up steps to get into the door. And so you got the resource that you specifically needed, but justice is more about making sure that you didn't even have to ask for that resource in the first place, that you could just go up to any building and access it without having your landlord build you a ramp or having doorways widened for you. So justice is the goal, but I think we end up operating hopefully in equity more than anything. Next slide, please. So when we look at our gardens, really it's about our equitable access, and are we creating access for systematically disadvantaged populations? And through this, there's ways we can make ourselves more approachable, make ourselves more accessible. These are more passive ways, having public events that occur regularly that everyone knows about. Opportunities are offered to teach gardening skills to community members, and really focusing on who you're offering those skills to. Having events that are hosted regularly so that everybody can meet and get to know each other, that goes a long way. And then very strategic outreach. So making sure you're tabling at events, you're writing articles for newsletters, your social media posts, interaction. These are a lot of passive ways that we can make ourselves and our gardens more accessible to everyone so they can find us. Next slide, please. But part of it is also realizing that society treats people differently, and we need to recognize the way that we are privileged. We're all going up the same hill, but some of us have different kinds of help along the way. So once we figure out how we are privileged, we can also then start thinking about where our blind spots are. There is no way I can understand what it's like to be a Nepali refugee. That is not part of my life experience. That is not something I will ever understand or know. So that's a blind spot. If I'm going to work with a wide variety with Nepali refugees, then I need to recognize that that's one of my blind spots, and identifying that that's a community that I need to work harder to understand and reach out to. So next slide, please. So a lot of this goes into active inclusion. So this is the goal, right? Is active inclusion. We want to make sure that populations that need accommodation or aren't represented are full partners in the garden, meaning that they have equal say in every decision-making process. They don't just exist in our gardens. They don't just come and garden. They actually participate in the decision-making processes. Your garden has an active approach, a proactive approach to it, so that everything is universally accessible in infrastructure and organizational practices as well. Infrastructure is important. It's very Everybody loves a raised bed. Everybody loves a paved path. These are very infrastructure, very obvious ways we can be inclusive. But it's really, really important to make sure that your organizational practices are inclusive as well. That, you know, everybody knows when your committee is meeting. You know, if you have a board, you know, it's kind of like the city of Lansing, right? Like if you don't know when the council meetings are, you can't actually express an opinion. So, so making sure that the way you organize your garden is accessible for people who want to give feedback. All right, next slide, please. And then, so finding those organizations is really important. Like if you have that blind spot, really going out of your way to identify and reach out to those organizations. And these are some of the ones we have in Lansing. They're different everywhere. You know, I can't imagine that Clare has a huge Congolese population, but you know, there are lots of different ways that Clare, Michigan is diverse, and they need to, you know, their garden leaders would have to go through and identify what organizations or what populations they might have. So these are some of the ones we have in Lansing. But knowing your populations and really actively seeking them out and thinking about how you can support their goals as much as they can help you find gardeners. And realizing, like, you know, realizing your privilege in the situation and really making that extra effort to talk to them and help them and support them. And really being curious. Curiosity is really that's how you create a multicultural space. That's like, if I could give you one thing to walk away with, it's be curious, ask questions, find out what the barriers are, you know, get to know people. And once you figure out, like, well, why didn't you come to that meeting we had? It's like, well, I couldn't find childcare. Now you've identified a barrier, and you can really get into universal accessibility, which is the next slide, please. So universal accessibility can be infrastructure, right? It can be raised beds, it can be pathways, ramps, large print signs, toys for kids, because I don't know if you've ever gardened with kids, but oh boy, it can get exciting real fast. They're not sure what a weed is. But yeah, really making sure you're identifying those barriers and then creating and then removing them. I mean, that's getting into justice and making sure that these things are available, making sure things are in multiple languages. You know, it's incredibly important. And sometimes it's things you didn't necessarily think would be a big thing, like just having toys for kids, having something for them to do over there while mom and dad garden over here. And having contact information is always helpful. Next slide, please. And then just celebrating diversity. I mean, we all want it. It's lovely. It makes us so much stronger. It makes our gardens better. It makes it more fun. You get to find out about a whole bunch of food that you never knew existed, and you know, so you can host potlucks. I mean, we're big on potlucks. We're a very food motivated crew, so we love potlucks. And you get to try so many different things. You can have a survey or registration that, you know, so you can share everyone's talents. Have an asset list, have things in multiple languages. I really can't stress that enough. But skill shares are always important too. Everybody has a different way of growing something, and you know, different crops that they grow. So if you could have, you know, skill shares about, you know, the African eggplant that person's growing and how they use it, or actually Muhammad is one of the pictures here. He'll go on and on about purslane and how you'll never have it's like a cure-all. You'll never get cancer if you eat purslane. So everybody has something very important to them that they would probably be happy to share. Next slide, please. So I do have some resources here. You can Google any of these and they'll come up. The test for implicit bias, I'm sure probably most of you have run across that by now. You know, we all have implicit bias, you know, that for whatever reason affects the way we make our decisions, and we might not even realize it. So this test is very helpful for like helping you determine where your blind spots might be. United Way of South Central Michigan does some great trainings on equity. and they're usually very specific to a population, so they're very helpful with resources. Gardening for Life was a great handbook I found. It's all about adaptive gardening. So all these different things you could do for seniors or people with mobility issues. Honestly, I think a lot of it would just be helpful for the rest of us if we wanted to garden later into life. Maybe I shouldn't be lifting a bunch of heavy things all the time and, bending over all the time. So that was a great resource. You really want to get into a lot of deep equity. Oregon Food Bank's equity trainings are pretty great. And I also recommend the Immigrant and Refugee Resource Collaborative. They have some great one-pagers and trainings if you wanted to dive deeper into specific cultures, especially if you're in the Lansing area. They have some great backgrounders, or like for the Afghan population and the Congolese. This is one of the resources there. Some of the cultures that we have more prevalent in Lansing. And next slide, please. And then this is our website. So we do have some resources. I'm working on getting more. And if you do identify a resource that you would like to have, shoot me an email, please let me know. So a lot of these resources we have come out of things garden leaders have asked for. Excuse me. So we have, how to use Google Translate. It's Google Translate. We all know how that works. So it is better with more common languages. The Spanish is great. The Dari and Pashto, not quite so much. But it's a great way to start. So there's how to use Google Translate on there. We also have some common garden phrases by language. So if you needed to just stick up a sign that says, no trash in the garden, or something very simple, those will have the English and then whatever the language is, so that you can copy and paste that into a text or a sign or however you would like to use it. And those are all on our website. Thank you, Julie, for sharing that link. But we all have different ways in which we're diverse, and this has been a lot of my experience with it. But if anybody has anything that they would like to share about a way that they've made their space more diverse or welcoming, or that they would like to share, I'm sure we'd all love to hear. Everybody a chance to maybe figure out their mute buttons. All right, well, these are two of my favorite quotes, is, do the best you can until you know better. I think that, especially with regards to equity, that's huge. Like, we're doing the best we can, and we don't all operate, at our highest all the time, but, it's okay to correct somebody and then figure it out and do better. And then my quote from Vu. This is one of my favorite blogs, but it's mostly like, equity has to be something that we're constantly working on and constantly learning and constantly getting better at, instead of just pulling it out to, impress someone. Yeah. All right, are there any questions, comments, concerns?
Nancy, feel free
comment on chat, or not, like on voice.
Oh yeah, please.
Oh yeah. I was
Like,
just about to say that.
because I literally can't type, and I can't read on the chat. I have vision issues. We are in a really homogenous community as far as ethnic diversity is concerned, but we're super excited this year that we're moving into doing a few allotments, kind of test running how we can do allotments. And one of our test, sort of test subjects, we just have a couple of them, is a person I met through, I do physical therapy, is somebody I met through there, and it seems he's a really knowledgeable gardener, and I think he's from the Philippines. You know, we don't talk a lot about personal stuff, so I am just really excited to have him because he's like, I want to grow something, and I don't even know what he's growing yet. So I think we're making a really interesting connection there. And we've also made a connection with 4-H, who will be learning and growing in our garden as well. So to be getting this kind of interaction for our community is a good thing. You know, to start opening up those kinds of communications in a different kind of way, because basically we've been just a donor garden. Not just a donor garden, we've been a donor garden.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to be exposing different parts of our community to different things and learning that way is I think a wonderful idea. And also, like, I'm hoping to connect Jimson with you guys, because he's like, he sources some of his resources from his connections back to where he's from. So I don't know if he can provide you with resources or not. I have no idea. So
That'd be fantastic. Thank you.
but we're so used to just being, you know, like your vanilla, all we know how to eat is tomatoes and zucchini. So
Oh, there's lots to share there too. So
yeah.
I love that about gardening because it attracts all kinds. You know, it literally transcends so many different
And
social boundaries.
we're slowly trying to find ways to build strengths in this year when we're putting in our fence. Graduate integrated health, which is mental health, is coming to help with that. So yeah, I feel like little ways we're trying to find ways to do that. We've got a long road to go. So, but yeah.
Every little bit helps. Every step is a way there.
Yeah.
Right. Tomorrow I see you off mute. Did you have something you wanted to share too, or? Okay. All right. Well, then if we wanted to, I'll hand it off to, I think, Julie, right?
We actually,
Oh, Matthew.
Yep.
There you go.
okay. All right. Well, the category that, so thank you so much, Stevie, for covering that speaker topic on developing a multicultural space. Of course, if there's more questions at the end, we can talk through stuff as stuff is starting to jingle around in our heads. So now to dive into some of the specific tools and tasks that need to be done this time of year. The first one that we're going to cover is within this category of membership and community building. So that this is somebody or a group of somebody's who is particularly focused on plot specific member coordination. And again, I just want to also remind us that some of these tasks that we're outlining are more specific to grow your own community gardens where there's individual plots for individual gardeners. But I hope and think that there is plenty here that would be helpful for community gardens that are modeled in a different way, donation gardens, for instance. So still a lot of good information here, regardless of what type of garden we're looking at. So plot assignment. During our last seminar, we talked about registration. Because again, it's when we're thinking about the seasons, it's good to try to gather people's applications or registration earlier on in the year. And you could still be doing that. It's only the beginning of April. but you could go back and look at our recording from that session to get a little bit more in-depth information about what it takes to register people effectively for your garden. But once you've got that information, then it's time to take that information and start to translate it and plug it into your garden map. So generally, this is an example here of one of our community gardens, not too close or not too far from the downtown Lansing area Armory Garden. It's a great one. And you can see with this one and with some other maps that we'll be looking at through today's presentation is that usually you've just got your plots numbered in some way. 1 through however many this is, 58 it looks like. It's a number of different plots. And you're taking the registration information, figuring out where to plug people in, what number would suit them best. And as an overview, what this whole process is you're just processing plot requests and registrations, as I've been saying. Managing the garden wait list is a part of that too. You might have a wait list. You've got more people interested in gardening than you have spaces for. Talk a little bit more about that too. And then just assigning plots based on what information you have and what space is available. The time frame for this is going to be, again, this time of year, anytime from March to very early June is when you're plugging people in.
Okay.
So some of the keys to success for this, here's another illustration of what a garden map could look like. Again, generally plots are numbered. So first, set clear expectations about when gardeners must sign up for a plot and what consequences exist if they miss the deadline. So again, set those clear expectations and guidelines. I think a question, just to give you a little heads up, a question that I have in a couple minutes at the end of my time is maybe just think about like, what would some of those consequences be if, and there will be more to the question than that. Another key to success is that generally it is beneficial for returning gardeners to be assigned to the same plot that they had. So the gardeners kind of know what to expect from year to year. Maybe some gardeners would be asking for a different plot. If that's the case, then you can work with that. But it's just generally good practice to put people in the same place year to year. It gets too chaotic if people are shifting around all the time. Also, another good tip is to be careful and strategic about the personal information that you're displaying on a garden plot map when you're making it public. So generally, it's a good idea to post people's plot assignments and like the main community space within your community garden, such as a tool shed or pavilion area, wherever people are going to congregate or have to interact with on a regular basis. So when people are going to come and see where they want to go, just make sure you're not displaying people's phone numbers and last names and other stuff. Otherwise, they're going to get spammed or something. So as you can see within this garden map illustration on this previous slide, we just had first names listed here. And then lastly, another note on equity, be clear, equitable, and consistent in how plots are assigned and how the wait list is managed. So a good tip here is just being transparent with people about this whole process. I think people and gardeners can get somewhat anxious around where they're going to be placed. And, plot assignment is a big deal. That's where you're going to be all year. So people care about it. So the best thing that you can do is just to be very clear and upfront with people about like, hey, this is how I do this. If you have disagreements, then you can talk through it and have conversations with people. Terrence, did you have something you wanted to comment on? I see a hand raised.
Yeah, is the idea that we will start managing this year? Because I participate at Clifford Park Garden, which was one of the gardens that you guys have ran previously. And so I know that I missed like the first couple minutes, so maybe you guys covered it then, but I know that we talked about if you're interested in leadership roles, and maybe I just missed that, but is this something that's specifically going to be coming to being assigned to somebody at my garden?
Great question. Yes, you have to do everything, Terrence. No, I'm just joking. Uh, no, it's the whole toolkit that we're outlining here. It's a series of 15 different tasks that we've identified as like this is what needs to happen in order for a community garden to get by from year to year. But we're just trying to. It's great that you're here this morning. We're just trying to give people start to introduce people to the tools and what needs to happen so that as you identify things that stick out to you as you're like, yeah, I think I'd like to plug in there. That sounds like a great idea. Then this is the first step in you feeling empowered and knowledgeable about like, oh, now I know how to do it. So
Yeah.
if you want to get involved in something like this at Clifford Park, then we will be very happy to say yes and amen to that. But also it's mostly just like what's jumping out at you and to others. It's a community process because it's not about you doing this alone. It's about you and others at Clifford gathering together, you talking with others and saying, hey, what do you want to do this year with me so that we can start to form something of a garden committee team.
Yeah, and I would I would love that. I last year it was really difficult to try to I was there at times when other people weren't there. So being able to get those connections was difficult. And then some of the people that I actually met, they didn't even live in my neighborhood. And that was the whole reason why I was trying to meet them. That was the whole reason why I wanted to do the garden in the first place, was so that I could like meet more people in my neighborhood. But I think I've only met like two people who lived in my neighborhood, which is cool. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to just like meet more people this year.
Those are all really good points. I would say that there are when if you're trying to build community, I think that there are other things we could other angles at which we could take this from, but like uh, we just really need to look at some of those key times when people are expected to be at the garden. So a key one is when the garden first opens during its orientation. So I'll let Julie speak to that a little bit more because she's going to be speaking about that in a few minutes. But maybe that's just something that she can dive into more, is like how to really connect with people during that moment, because that's one of the few times in the year when it's like everybody's expected to be there, and that's a moment where you can capture folks and say like, hey, let's try to build some stronger connections throughout the rest of the year. So, so anyway, thanks, Terrence. Yeah, feel free to continue to raise your hand or ask questions in the chat, or just unmute yourself as you'd like. So those were just some of the main keys and plot assignments. Some other tips are to use the registration form strategically for how you gather information. The stuff that is going to be helpful as you're figuring out where to place people. So are there any accommodations or languages or accessibility needs? That might help you identify, like, again, back to this illustration here, you can see that there's a number of raised beds, it looks like, at the front end. You might want to collect information from people at the outset about accessibility so you can know like, oh, that person needs to be placed in a raised bed because they're in a wheelchair, for instance. You're not going to make them go way back to plot 45 there. And also allocate plots based on your garden's values and vision. So this is another question I had for some of you later on, but yeah, are there values that you've identified within your community garden that maybe you want to have a preference to bring people in from your surrounding neighborhood? Or do you always assign returning gardeners first? So just keep those things in mind. Some more tips. Check with all the previous gardeners to see who is returning and who is not. Generally, it is a basic practice to fill in with people who are returning. You can gather that information in the previous fall, or you can gather it later in the spring. But the earlier you grab it, usually the better. And then this illustration, you can see I started to highlight some of the plots. When I'm filling in and doing this process, it is just a simple process of taking all the registration information, who is registered, having a long list of names and contact information and whatnot, whatever you've gathered, and then just like having a map next to me, and I'm just taking a highlighter or a pencil or a pen and just marking and starting to plug people into the map. It's actually really fun. So if anybody wants to do this, this is a fun one. Just plugging and playing. Another tip is to set new gardeners up for success. So that's another piece of information you can gather. How long have you been gardening for? Like, don't place them in a plot that might have some more challenges. Not that you want any of those plots, but maybe that's just the reality. You have a space that tends to get a little bit wetter or something like that. Another tip is to place gardeners who need physical accommodations near the front. I already said that. And then lastly, consider whether applicants have family and friends who have also applied, because they might want to be together. That's something that is fairly common within our gardens. You might have a mother and a daughter who applied for 2 plots and they just really want to be together, understandably. So you can also gather that information too. Some considerations for when the number of applicants is greater than the number of plots available. Obviously, everybody still wants a slice of the pie. That's the great illustration of pie there. Looks yummy. So provide plots to those aligned with the garden mission. If you've gone through all these other steps and you still just have more people applying than you have space for, that's when you can go back to your garden mission and start to see like, okay, we really do want people who are from within this neighborhood, or we really do want people, we can think back to Stevie's presentation a few minutes ago about equity and diversity. Maybe we want to create, a diverse, population in this way. So, and then another point there is to assign plots on a first come, first served basis. That's a simple thing that you can do too, if you want to avoid everything else I was just talking about. Just like, well, they registered early. So, and again, we're going to talk more about the welcome meeting and orientation soon, but how you can share plot assignments. Generally, we recommend just doing that during the spring orientation. It's a great time to grab everybody together, and because everybody needs to know this, so it's a time where you can create some community and encourage people to be together. After that orientation, you're going to want to post that up someplace. So it's a good idea to post that, as I mentioned earlier, up on a tool shed or someplace like that. Just make sure, your important tip with that whatever you're posting up there is going to be able to endure the weather and the rain. So you could put it in some kind of like a container with a lid, or there's waterproof paper that's kind of expensive that you can also purchase. So, oh, Linda just had a comment. Do you have any recommendations for plot size for a 2-acre garden? Our common plot size within our community gardens is 25 feet by 25 feet. Julie or Stevie, do you want to comment on that any further?
I mean, go ahead, Julie.
Well, let's both share, we'll probably have different perspectives on that. One thing it's nice to know is what the gardener wants. And so that could be a really good question to add onto your registration form, or, to bring up during the opening meeting. It surprises me even sometimes how clear people are about what size that they want. And so it really varies. Sometimes we'll give them a 25 by 25 plot and their eyes drop because they were thinking a 4 by 8 bed. For some reason, that was just in their head. And then if you were to show a bed that size to somebody with, multiple kids that's been gardening so long, they'd say, this is not a garden even. So, it's nice with a 2-acre space. You could go really big. But I would say in general, start on the smaller side, as opposed to just saying anyone and everyone, you're going to get a big garden bed just because we have two acres available. So you want to round that out, Stevie?
Yeah, no, I would say the same thing, whatever the community wants. Some of our most successful gardens have different sized beds. That I mean that brings up a whole different conversation of equity and how much people pay per plot versus the size of the bed. But it does really give people a different kinds of options um, to plug in. So if they are gardening at a more experienced level, or they're gardening for income, then they can have the larger bed. Or if they're just, one person who just really wants, 5 tomato plants, then they'll, they'll have the smaller bed. But I would really talk to your community and see what size that's in their head first. Because if they're, yeah, like if Julie said, if they're all thinking, a 4x8 bed, then they're going to be very shocked when they get something much bigger.
I'll share one other thing. We don't do this. We're as a program of the food bank, our mission is more to make things as accessible as possible to at any income levels. But that, community gardens can really vary in how much they charge for a plot as well. And that's something to consider. We haven't moved to this model, but one thing you might want to think about is like 5 cents per square foot. So in that model, a 25 by 25 bed, which for us is a large plot, but it is a standard size plot, would be about $30. Still very reasonable price, especially when you look at community garden plot prices across other communities. But if you are, that would be one model. For us, we just say a standard size plot is $15. We encourage a donation if you are in a financial place that you can offer more, since that price is subsidized. And for some larger, really quite large plots that we have available, it's an additional fee. So that really varies. That's not what you asked about in terms of size, but if you do have a price component, that's something to consider as well.
Do you figure out these prices based off of the amenities that are available at each garden as well? Because like some gardens have, spigots and water and others might not.
I can speak to the food bank for the gardens that we register. We just share again, we try to make that every plot as available as financially accessible to anyone. So that's why we have a minimum, we have a plot fee of $15, which is a highly subsidized rate. And that way, even if there are, what you would say like minimal amenities, like if you are having to carry water to your plot or there might not be a shed on site, it's still a very accessible fee for someone. So you're getting above and beyond in resources what you are having. But if you're thinking about gardens, other gardens where there might be different resources available to different gardeners, that could be something that you factor in. And happy to drill down and talk about that more at the end or another time too. So
I just also wanted to note too, as we're thinking about plot sizes, I like how in the illustration for this one, how you just clearly have spaces that are divided into different size beds. So I think that as I mentioned that just because I'm thinking about making it logistically possible for you, whoever you are managing plot assignments, probably be better to just organize it very clearly so that you don't have to dice things up in a bunch of weird ways throughout your space. So it might be helpful logistically just to lay it out in a particular way. So you have large plots in one section, medium-sized plots in another, small plots in another. I mean, if anybody disagrees with that point, feel free to shout out, but I feel like that would make it easier if for the whoever's managing that. So great. I mean, these are great questions. And yeah, thanks for sharing the link to that waterproof paper that we mentioned earlier as well. So yeah, and lastly, just I mean, as the questions indicate, plot assignment can be tricky, but you're trying to balance a lot of people's tasks. And like Terrence was just talking about too, there's different amenities and accommodations that we can look at in terms of water access and whatnot too. There's lots of things to think about through this. So I'd mentioned before gathering people's information to make it more accessible, but I think water access, I just wanted to note, is one of those things to look at too when assigning people to spaces. it's not too infrequent that we have people saying, hey, I have a hard time with limited mobility. Could I just be closer to the spigot? And of course, we try to accommodate those sorts of requests when they come through. So, yeah, that is, I think, it for that part of the presentation. If anybody would like to share some thoughts around this question, feel free to submit that into the chat or just unmute yourself and talk. What other values does your garden have by which you might prioritize applicants? You talked a bit about neighborhood priority, but yeah, I was actually just kind of curious as to this one, if there was anything else that people might have that other than neighborhood priority, because I feel like that's a biggie. But so if nobody has anything else, that's totally fine. But if it pops into your head in 5 minutes, put it into the chat for us. I would be fascinated to hear. So
I just have kind of an interesting question. How would you prioritize a gardener that it say they want to just do a whole plot of corn, um and it does really well, and so it grows really high. How would you go about like assigning a good space in the garden to a gardener that might be growing something that could potentially block out sun to some of your other plots?
that's a good question. I mean, my initial reaction to that is going to be trying to place people who are going to be growing taller plants on the north side of the garden so that it's not going to shade them out, since the sun is always slightly set in the southern part of the sky. But that, I don't know that we gather that information about, like, or maybe we do. Julie, Stevie, you could correct me, but it might be good information to grab from people. It's like, hey, are you going to be growing 10-foot tall corn? If you are, putting you on the north side. So,
Yeah, I just asked because, well, one, I had grew last year was my first time growing, and I grew some plants that I had no intention, some tomatillo plants that I had no intention were going to become absolutely massive. And so when I planted 5 of them, I was just thinking, oh yeah, no big deal. And they turned into these huge bushes, and they kind of like blocked out my own sun. But in addition, like I was in the middle and there was a plot next to me, and they had a ton of corn. Now, I don't know that it was a huge issue to me, or maybe it's not an issue at all, but I was just wondering how that worked.
I thought, yeah, I think that
So,
was it's a great question, Terrence. I don't know that there's anything you can do other than try to gather people's intentions as best as you can and say, if you're growing tall crops, we're gonna try to place you on the north side of,
well, I appreciate your perspective. Thanks.
yeah.
It might also be good for during, I guess, new gardener orientation when you have your first meeting to just tell gardeners, if you're planning to grow something like that, consider your neighbors and what they might be growing and what impact your plant might have on them. And don't just grow something that's, these 10-foot tall sunflowers that are going to basically create a forest. So that's just courtesy, I guess, to other gardeners, basically.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I just wanted to say thank you for making that comment, because we're playing around with some vertical gardening notions and using hog panels, cattle panels, and we may be creating the same situation just in doing that. So we need to be mindful of casting shade. So it's appreciated.
Well, now I'm just in like brainstorm mode. Maybe you like create different zones or something. You're like, you can go to the tall zone over there. This over here is the short squatty garden. Oh, good
One
work.
thing,
This could be brilliant.
one thing for me that I notice is helpful when growing tall crops is that although it's like people tell you to grow it on the north side, it's actually, I found, at least in my gardening, it was more effective to grow it in a row from north to south in one area so that when it shaded it out, since they were all growing the same height, it was like a minimal amount of area that was shaded from the plot behind you. And since they're all tall, they all got sun in that row. So sometimes I play around with changing my rows from horizontal east-west to vertical north-south that are tall, and to minimize the area that's shaded behind me.
That is brilliant. Brilliant, Alexia. I'm writing down that tip. Okay. I think we got to give that one. Okay. We are moving on.
All right. And I'm back with the maintenance section, although this is a lot of really good conversations. So I'm gonna, mine is, if you want to go to the next slide, actually, it's under maintenance, whatever group of people you have in your maintenance category. One of their responsibilities will be spring plotting. And if you are a no-till garden that doesn't have a tractor come through and wipe out all your plot markers every year, you can use this as your break time. But for the rest of us who have a tractor come through every year, or we till the garden every year, spring plotting is something you're going to have to do. And this is a great task for somebody who's like very visual, wanted, I don't know, to be in landscaping or something very visual person should do. Next slide, please. So these are some of the tools you're going to want. This is a very straightforward section, so I'm probably going to talk pretty quick, but let me know if you have any questions. We really like our 300-foot tape measures. My favorite personally, and I didn't think I would ever have opinions on tape measures, but my favorite personally is the cheap one from Menards. When you get a bunch of dirt and mud into it, this is the one that cleans up the easiest and still manages to spool properly. You can get the surveying wheels if you have a very smooth, flat garden. This will work well for you. I have yet to run into a very smooth, flat garden, so they kind of like jump sometimes. Good marker and a good mallet help too, because you got to pound a lot of stakes in. The markers you use to mark your plots is really up to you. You just want something that's very highly visible. So in our gardens, we found it's cheapest and most effective to get bamboo stakes, the like 3-foot, 4-foot bamboo stakes, and just spray paint a very attractive color on the end of it. I will say green is not a very recognizable color in the garden, no matter how fluorescent it is. So I would not use green. We usually use like orange and blue. But again, this gets into accessibility too. If you have people who are colorblind, we ran into this problem. Orange and blue also not very visible. So really knowing your population helps. And then we'll go through with the giant popsicle sticks down there and write the garden plot numbers on them and plop them into the garden so that everybody can find their number. If you want to put names on it, that really helps make sure everybody gets to the right plot, though. Next slide, please. And really, it's just basic geometry, length and width. Picking one spot to measure from and using it every year really helps. If you have a solid landmark you can use, like a fence post, or making your own with a T-post, and making sure that's the spot you measure from every year, so you know exactly how big your plots are, and just going down the line. I will say it's very important to make sure you account for pathways when you're doing that too, because you want to make sure that everybody has access to their plot. So if you forget to put in a pathway somewhere and you end up with just a whole row of plots, people are either going to start making their own pathways, or you're going to have a lot of phone calls. So, and then, once you get everything down, you can just move the tape measure all the way down your garden. And I will say, this is something we can also come help with too. We've helped some gardens plot their gardens, plot their plots. Next slide, please. Tips and tricks. Yeah, I think I've actually mentioned all this. Make sure every plot has access. One of the things I learned last year was don't put the spigots in the middle of the path. So when you're measuring out and marking your paths, if you put a spigot in the middle of it on paper, it looks great. In practice, it gets run over by a wheelbarrow. So, so it makes it very hard for wheelbarrows to get down the pathway if there's a spigot in the middle of it. So when you're measuring it, make sure you're accounting for obstacles that might be in the pathways. Pictures, I mean, if you've limited English proficiency, or really just for anybody, pictures are always better than words. If you can put a picture or use a Google image, it really helps people figure out where they are in the space. And when you're making a map, you don't make a legend, make sure you know what your pictures mean, and keep notes too. So if if you know how big your bed is, make sure that gets recorded somewhere. If you had where your irrigations are, if you have power lines running down the middle of your garden, make sure they're accounted for, so you don't have too many surprises. Irrigation lines really help to know where those are, because then you don't hit them with something. Next slide, please. And these are some examples of some different, what maps would look like in different programs. So however you make and save your map, whether it's using Excel, which is great if your garden is very boxy. That's the problem with Excel, right? It's a bunch of little boxes. So if your lines are all straight, Excel works great. The same for Word. Word will work, but the problem is if you scoot one thing in Word, it like adjusts everything else. So it can be challenging to use exclusively for your garden mapping. Publisher, you can use Publisher if you are good with it. I find Publisher challenging. It just doesn't work with my brain, I guess. I don't know. If you're very, very techy, there's other programs like ArcGIS out there. But I would have to recheck my college notes on that one. Next slide, please.
There's also graph paper and a pencil.
Yes, that is a great one. Yeah, if you're not, I love that. Yeah, it's always graph paper and a pencil, and a lot of people just default to that because it's easy and accessible. This is one of the ones I've been using. It's called Garden Planner. It's pretty like, I don't know, like early. This was definitely developed in like the early 90s. It's a pretty bare bones program, but you can make a great map, or at least a functional map. Actually, Alexia, you should recognize this map. So I have the spigots recognized in it. This one does layers too, so you can show different parts of the garden at different times or turn them off. So I do have a layer for this one where it does have the irrigation lines saved on it, but really just making sure that you have all the basic landmarks recognized on it. I also put plot sizes on this because I never remember how big the plots are. So the microscopic print there is telling me how big the plots are. So this is actually a really good example of a garden where we have multiple different plot sizes. So, the ones on the east side are a little smaller than the ones on the west side. And we also have 3 much larger plots there, which usually get assigned to gardeners who are very experienced in gardening at a pretty high level. And some just smaller ones based on, there's a pavilion in the way. So that goes into my next slide, please, which we actually just talked about. Other ways to make a map. I don't know all the programs out there, so if anybody else has another program or, graph paper always works.
I just want to second Lauren's point. I'm a big lover of graph paper, but sometimes I'll find myself without any. And just as a tip, you can always Google some, print out your own graph paper if you don't have a binder full of graph paper from, I don't know, Meyer or wherever you buy it from. So I found that helpful.
I mean, the most important thing is that it just gets saved somewhere, so you don't want to hit the irrigation line and then have to, dig through a bunch of stuff to figure out, where the irrigation line was. It's better to just know where it is in the first place. That's all I have. It's pretty straightforward. If you need help, give us a call. We're always willing to help.
All right, thank you so much, Stevie. Before I jump into coordination, our last little session of the morning, I will mention that everything that we have been putting in the chat is on our website. So that's just an option for people who like to jump around while they're being talked at over Zoom. So we will also be sending these links in a follow-up email. So, the toolkit pages house all the supplemental additional documents. So you can find that on our website, glfoodbank.org/garden project. So I'm going to jump in with you all now.
Julie, you just went on mute.
Thank you.
Back.
My hands were not attached to my brain. All right, so next slide, let's get started. The two main components that I want to speak to you about on coordination are how to successfully host a spring garden orientation. So a few of you have already caught our references to how important and how once in a season this opportunity presents itself to gather folks together to do so much. So if you are interested in taking on this component as part of the leadership team to facilitate a spring garden orientation, we'll walk you through those steps right now. That time commitment would be anytime kind of like from now, basically from early March till your garden opens, which could be as late as, late May. And then it is kind of nice for those that, maybe are not around as much in the summer, or some of the other things that we will be teaching on later this year you're not going to have as much time available then. This is kind of like a one-off, you're going to be gearing up to host it, you're going to host it, you're going to have follow-up, and that commitment is done. Next slide. So in preparation for the spring opening meeting, we'll take some planning up front. We suggest 2 weeks in advance to begin getting the word out that orientation meeting will be coming up. And I didn't mention this in the last slide, but I did mean to say, actually, I'll hold off, sorry. So about 2 weeks in advance. And you do want to line up to make sure that appropriate accommodations are available. So Stevie mentioned, childcare is a tough one. I mean, the garden is at that time of year could be a pretty easy place for a kiddo to come. And sometimes it's just saying, just bring your kids, even if you're having your orientation meeting in a library nearby, kids are welcome. So just putting that out there that please come. It might be having interpretation available. And it could be involved, getting some written information on what you're going to cover out to gardeners in advance. That's really helpful. That's one thing, an accommodation I ask, my boss for sometimes if, it's like if you have anything that I could read and brief myself on before we sit and have that discussion, that's always really helpful for me. So you may say, here's our agenda, what we'll be offering, here are the guidelines that we'll be reviewing. You could put a sign up in the garden. That's especially nice if you have space in the garden and you want to let the neighbors know, hey, there is space. We're having a opening meeting. Please just come join us. That's a great model to take. Phone calls, emails. The impetus is on proactive communication there. Next slide. Where to host that garden? Of course, the garden is generally the number one go-to place to have that garden orientation. Some do rent out a community room at a community center, or again, a library, a church nearby, a school. You can certainly do it over Zoom. So those are all options. Next slide. And then you're going to get into what you will offer. So your opening meeting day has come. You will have an agenda available. A lot of times I'll put a carrot out and say, at the opening meeting, not only is it required to start this year, but that is when we will have the map available. That is when we'll have plot assignments. Truly, once people know, especially if they're a returning gardener, that, hey, I know this garden. I know where my plot is. I am ready to roll. You want to incentivize that a little bit, because not only are the guidelines important, to Terrence's point and others' point, that's your opportunity for people to get to know each other. So if you do have a goal and a vision of the garden, that this will be a space, not just that people can grow in their own plots, but as a place to foster community, your orientation time when the garden opens is the place to get people together. So in addition to that, so be strategic as you are asking people to introduce themselves. That might even take up a large part of your meeting, where if you're really saying, we are here to get to know each other, we're here to learn more about what's drawn you to the garden, what do you hope to get away, to get out of this season, and really leave where people, I have the feeling of, I am connected not just to this space, but I am connected to the community gardeners that I'll be participating with this season. That could be a really good time as well to have a sense to draw up more leadership for your community garden. So ask people, how are you looking to give back to the garden this year? What is your capacity? What are your strengths? We talked about this in some previous seminars, and this is a time you could put together a community gardener asset map of what connections and what strengths do we have amongst our own group. Very important component of that orientation agenda are the guidelines. I'll speak briefly to that in a slide coming up, but that is your time to let people know how to use that space. And then lastly, especially if you're at the garden, giving a tour of the infrastructure there, providing information on plot assignment, and then closing up. I do want to say that, you know, with technology now, there are options to do recordings. There could be somebody in your group that could make a snippet of you sharing some of the guidelines as well. So you could even post that to our website. Every garden in the network has access to our website, their own webpage. Next slide. I do want to make mention that if you have new Americans as part of the garden, absolutely, they should be part of that leadership team and leading and part of that orientation meeting. So sometimes we call those new Americans serving on leadership a cultural broker. That's a term that you'll hear sometimes, that are really trying to provide that translation amongst everyone. Sometimes call them garden ambassadors. If you'd like to learn more about how you could even provide a stipend if you have somebody that you're working with that speaks a language that you don't, and they are providing some significant support during that orientation meeting or at other times of the season, we do have a small pot of funds available to reimburse them for that as a garden ambassador. And to the 2 points at the bottom, just so important, because yes, they bring in diverse set of ideas and knowledge and certainly vegetables to the garden, but one way we've really found it for me so helpful to have shared leadership is just the perspective, viewing issues that come up in the garden and that can be pre-addressed in orientation meetings through a different lens. You know, Stevie spoke to this before, a lens that just rounds out our overall understanding of our community garden network. Next slide. When you are at that meeting, give yourself a little favor, do yourself a favor and read a little bit in advance. How can I be a good meeting facilitator? And that really boils down to these points, you know, coming prepared, having written materials, coming prepared. While we're there, you will have an agenda that you are hoping to get through, and with times and bullet points, and listening carefully during the meeting to really pull out the perspectives of those attendees is so important. In general, guiding the meeting without controlling, providing space for questions, for experiences and stories is great. Certainly, if a problem comes up, that is a great opportunity to solve that. And one way we do that during opening meetings, if an issue comes up where, hey, the corn is an issue or people aren't wrapping up the hose, do not feel during that meeting in your role that you have to fix and solve that. That is a great time to put that issue back to the group of gardeners to say, let's figure this out together. Let's get creative and let's come up with a collective solution. You have so much more buy-in with implementation at that phase if people have come up with that solution on their own. Just remember that your energy will be mirrored back to you in many cases. So as much as you're able to just let people know that, hey, we are here to be community together, we are here to welcome you. That is great. Check for understanding. We say often in our role in communication is not to just put out the information. Our role is to check for understanding as well. It is not enough to say, hey, I emailed you the guidelines, you should be good to go. That is your opportunity to hear back from people. Are you understanding what I'm trying to communicate now? And then just try during that meeting for that perfect balance of, connecting with people there and getting done what you're really trying to do of sharing those guidelines. Next slide. You may consider putting together a welcome packet. This is one that has been modified by a garden at Unitarian Universalist Church. This is helpful for those of us that don't, we're just being bombarded with new information in a meeting and saying, what are my takeaways? We will share that out in the follow-up email, both the link to this packet and a template, a blank template that you could work through and put together on your own. They did not do this season one. They gardened for a couple years. They started accumulating guidelines and information about the garden, collecting it, and every year they add a little bit more. So next slide. And then have some time at your meeting for showing and telling. So that might be how to unlock the shed. Combo locks are tricky. A lot of us haven't used them since our high school locker days. How much compost you could receive when it comes. Just walking through the garden to see different plots. Sometimes it can be fun just to, here is your plot right here. Yay, let's everyone move on. So just use that time to really show people what they're going to need in the season ahead. Also a great time to take a video of some of these things that you might then send out over email or text to people. Almost wrapping up, but next slide here. I mentioned the guidelines that your garden will have. We will send you a couple great links on both the why guidelines are important, and I don't think I'll go through all these bullet points for sake of time, but we have some great resources on why guidelines are important to have in your garden and then how to set those. And a lot of times, next slide, those guidelines come from, oh my gosh, what sign did I find myself making last August about this is a disaster, it's not going well, the hoses are not wrapped, or kids are playing with water, or there are piles of weeds and beans in the compost. That's probably a lot what your guidelines are going to stem from. So take note of what you were noticing last year that needed to be dealt with, and those could be the basis of your guidelines. And then I'll just share at the end here that not everyone will be able to come, no matter how coordinated you have made your meeting and welcoming. Not everyone, scheduling is very difficult. So be sure to follow up with an email of the guidelines, the meeting notes for those that didn't come, and options to meet you or perhaps someone else. That could be a really good shared leadership task for someone else that was at the meeting that said, hey, you did the bulk of the main orientation. I can track down, this handful of folks that weren't able to attend and give them their own follow-up and orientation at the end. All right, so we kind of flew through that, but that's why we have those written documents for you all to read more on those toolkit pages. But please have a welcome orientation. That's our main thing. How you do it is up to you. But just it will serve the garden and the community so well if you're able to carve out some time for that this year. Matthew?
Right. Thanks so much, Julie. Sorry if I missed that last slide for you. But yeah, well, just like Julie was talking about and facilitating meetings, I hope that this was all helpful for you guys to do some reflecting back here. Let us know if there's if you're understanding things like we're putting it out there by letting us, you can speak back at us if you'd like. But so if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, now's the time to let us know. And we will be having that follow-up email as well that we've alluded to with a lot of these links that we're posting in the chat. Just as a note here, if you haven't put your email into the chat, that might be helpful for us if you put that in. We can see, for some of you, we see your first name listed, and I think for a lot of you, we do have your emails within our network in our database, but still, it might just be helpful for us to have that right at the ready so we can email this to you in the near future. So maybe one last question for us to interact with before we get going is to think through if your garden has guidelines or a handbook. Again, we will be happy to share that one that Julie was just referring to. If you do, we talk a little bit about some consequences when rules are not followed. If anybody has any thoughts on that, feel free to share. And then also maybe another question to throw out there too is, what is one idea that resonated with you this morning, and how could you put that into action? Especially a SMART action, for those of you who are familiar with SMART goals. Specific, measurable, and I don't remember all the rest of the acronym. Thanks for sharing your emails within the chat, everybody. Nancy, I thought you couldn't interact with the chat. I'm just giving you a hard time. Thank you.
Yeah, if anyone wants to come off mute and just share as well, feel free, but we always love hearing from you. That's really how we've put together a lot of these toolkit items, and a lot of what we share back is hearing how people actually are implementing. So feel free, but also no pressure.
Okay, well, you can keep those questions in your mind. It's 11:29, so we're 1 minute away from our 90-minute marker. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. Oh, was somebody unmuted? Sorry. So again, just want to look forward to some of the next events that we're going to have in this series. Earlier on, when I was talking about the Resource Center, I mentioned our in-person RC orientation. So that's going to be coming Friday, May 3rd from 3:30 to 5:15. You see that at the top there, where we're going to be doing a tour of our Resource Center and an introduction to all garden committee members about what our open hours are going to look like throughout the rest of the spring and into the early summer. Those are on Fridays, where you can come pick up extra plants from us as you have in past years. But also, we just want to emphasize that's a time for you to connect with us and ask further questions if you'd like. So that'll be happening May 3rd. And then again in June, at the beginning of June, we're going to be having another pair of these virtual and in-person seminars where we're going to be diving into topics that are pertinent to that part of the year. It'll carry throughout the rest of the summer until we meet again later in August. And then we're going to end the year in a really fun potluck. Well, actually, I don't think the potluck is listed here. We're going to have it is, but we're going to have a potluck. But before we have that potluck, we're going to have a committee member happy hour where we can get feedback from you all. So looking forward to all those events throughout the rest of this year. And last slide, here's our contact info. If any of you would like to reach out to us with anything, please email or call us. We'd love to talk with you further. And we just want to be a support and a resource for all of you. So well, that concludes our time. If anybody wants to stick around and talk through any questions, feel free to stay on the call. Otherwise, that's all of our formal points. Thanks for coming, Terrence. It was great to have you this morning. Hope you have a good weekend too.
Thank you. See you later, everybody.
Good to see you, Lauren. Take care.
Thank you all. So nice to be with you this morning. Nice to leave you in some sunshine now too. Enjoy your days.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Nancy. Good to see you. Good to see you too, Tamara.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. You have a good day.
You also. Ah.
Okay. Wonder if Nancy's still. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and copy this chat and end the recording.
Yep.
I remember to end that.